Hello there! In this video, we're going to try and answer the question, what if Jar Jar Binks was the Chosen One? Now, that is already assuming that he isn't the Chosen One in the actual story of Star Wars, which is entirely possible. He is clearly very gifted with the Force. But in all seriousness, this is a suggestion from one of you guys, so if you have a suggestion of your own, put it in the comments, and it might end up getting made like this one. Thanks so much for this suggestion, and without further ado, we'll get on with the video. So our story starts just as Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon, the Queen, her handmaidens, and everyone else who was with her escape Naboo on the royal starship, and just like we see in episode 1, they would have to break through the blockade, and the ship would be shot at. As the ship shook and jolted with each hit, Jar Jar would lose his footing and would stumble into G8R3, the droid, and fall over, and as he fell, the Gungan's flailing arms would catch on the photoreceptor of the astromech, cutting his arm. Due to the chaos of the situation, Jar Jar wouldn't really notice this small injury, and would proceed to drag himself to his feet and make his way to the cockpit, and would once again take a tumble, this time into Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn. Both of them would fall to the floor, and in the ensuing fiasco, Qui-Gon's comm device and more importantly the blood test attachment for the comm device would fall from his robe. After chastising the Gungan for his clumsiness and brushing himself off, Qui-Gon would return his focus to the ongoing escape, not realizing that Jar Jar had picked up his equipment and began to investigate it. Just like in The Phantom Menace, the group would break through the blockade and once again would not give R2 enough credit, but would be forced to land on Tatooine due to a damaged hyperdrive. So Qui-Gon, Padme, R2 and Jar Jar would set out and would end up in Watto's shop. And like in the film, Jar Jar would pick up something from one of the shelves of scrap and would quickly be told not to touch anything by Qui-Gon, who would swiftly return the item to its rightful place, and as he did so, the Jedi would spot his comlink in the belt of the Gungan, which he would just as swiftly return to its rightful place in his robes, along with the blood test attachment, overlooking the now dry Gungan blood covering parts of the equipment from Jar Jar's previous altercation with G8R3. Rest in peace. Or more like rest in pieces, am I right? So things would appear to proceed unaltered from the regular timeline. The group would meet Anakin Skywalker, Qui-Gon would believe him to be the Chosen One, and eventually, after some morally questionable gambling, Qui-Gon would perform a blood test on Anakin, or so he thought. Obi-Wan would sit in the Naboo Royal Shuttle, watching as the data of the analysis of the blood was collected. The midichlorian count would be off the chart. Over 20,000. Qui-Gon would, after his brief discussion with his apprentice, be about to end the communication when Obi-Wan would notice something on the analysis. This wasn't human blood, it was Gungan blood, and after a long pause whilst both Jedi tried to comprehend what was going on, Obi-Wan would break the silence by asking if this meant that, but before he could finish, Qui-Gon would cut him off, declaring that they would discuss this later, and that they should both meditate on the findings. Qui-Gon would end the communication and look out over the street below. What should he do now? He had thought he'd found the Chosen One, which he had, but it wasn't this boy, instead it was Jar Jar. Thinking back over the limited time he'd spent with the Gungan, he would realise there had been times when Jar Jar had showed some degree of Force sensitivity, he supposed. After some time meditating on the matter, Qui-Gon would decide that he would continue with his initial plan, to rescue Anakin, and Shmi if possible, he does like Shmi, and train the boy. He would attempt to convince himself that a high midichlorian count wasn't necessarily an indication of how good a Jedi or a Force user in general a person could be, although he would have to admit that his enthusiasm to train Anakin would have waned upon the revelation of Jar Jar's midichlorian count, and the Jedi Master would also begin to feel a degree of skepticism surfacing regarding Anakin's father, or supposed lack of father. Nonetheless, the boy was still very clearly gifted, even if some of the claims made about him were potentially rather exaggerated. So the day of the Boon to Eve pod race would come, and would largely go the same way as it does in The Phantom Menace. Anakin would still win, but Qui-Gon wouldn't help but notice that Jar Jar was, at points in the race, seemingly using the Force, albeit unknowingly, to aid the boy, willing the boy on and actually affecting the race. After the race, just like in the actual timeline, Qui-Gon, Padme, Jar Jar, R2, and now Anakin would return to the starship with the newly acquired hyperdrive, and travel to Coruscant, where Qui-Gon would travel to the temple to talk to the council about Maul and request that he could train Anakin. This time though, he would not be able to make the claim that Anakin was a virgin in the Force and would not have any desire to make his discovery regarding Jar Jar known to the council, having come to the decision it better not to make the Gungan's power known, considering his considerable clumsiness. Unfortunately for Qui-Gon, without the leverage of Anakin being the chosen one, the council would be even more adamant in their denial of Anakin being trained, and despite Qui-Gon's attempts to argue a case, he would also be less incentivized to train the boy. Yes, he was clearly gifted, but not as much as Qui-Gon had initially hoped and thought, and this disappointment would somewhat dampen his desire to train the boy. The events of The Phantom Menace would then continue as they do in the film, with Qui-Gon being killed at the hands of Maul, but this time as Qui-Gon lay there contemplating his final moments, he would be aware of the ongoing battle between this Sith and his apprentice. This Tatooine boy wasn't his Padawan, Obi-Wan was. So when Obi-Wan defeated Maul and would kneel beside his master, Qui-Gon would not use his final breaths to encourage Obi-Wan to train Anakin. Instead, he would tell his apprentice how proud he was, and that Obi-Wan would be a great Jedi. You know, something a little less pressurizing for a clearly traumatized boy, like his Padawan was at the time that he just watched Maul basically kill his master. Meanwhile, above the planet, Anakin, much like in the real timeline, would still successfully destroy the Separatist command ship, because although he may not be the chosen one, he still knew that spinning was a good trick, and he would implement this trick to its fullest effect. So after the fighting had ended and Qui-Gon's funeral had concluded, a word of Anakin's heroics would begin to circulate. The Jedi, however, would have no intention to train the boy, and so wouldn't train him. So we now have a situation in which the Chosen One exists, but Obi-Wan is the only one who knows of his Force sensitivity, and Anakin has been freed, but won't be trained, well, not as a Jedi, because, while following the events on Naboo, a vacancy would have opened for the role of Sith apprentice, and Palpatine would be very keen to train Anakin, following his contribution to the battle on Palpatine's homeworld. So rather than as a Jedi, Anakin would be trained as a Sith. Despite this, mostly due to Anakin's age, Palpatine would still need a political puppet to help him play both sides of the war that he intended to start. So he would still approach the former Jedi Master Dooku, now Count of Sereno, and proceed to take the Count as a Sith apprentice. Or that's what he would tell the Count, who would be unaware of Palpatine's true apprentice, Anakin, and that Dooku was no more than a puppet in Palpatine's machinations. So Palpatine would have two apprentices, Dooku, his political puppet, and Anakin, whom he would consider to be his true apprentice, and over the next 10 standard years Palpatine would train both of them, using Dooku much like he does in the prequels to heighten political instability and form the confederacy of independent systems, whilst unknown to the Count training Anakin in the ways of the dark side. Palpatine would use these 10 years to build up hate and anger in the young boy, specifically for the Jedi, how they had taken him from his home and abandoned him, how they had no inclination to free the slaves on Tatooine, how they had failed in their arrogance, and that if Anakin wanted to improve the galaxy, the dark side was his only path. During this time, Jar Jar would continue oblivious to his power and become a representative for the Gungans in the Senate, like we see in the prequels. So after these 10 years, Anakin would be very proficient with the dark side. Remember though, he isn't quite as gifted with the Force as we're used to, as he's not the chosen one. However, he would grow impatient as he watched Palpatine try to orchestrate what seemed to be an extremely convoluted plan to gain political power, when Anakin was far more interested in destroying Jedi and saving his mother and other slaves, and would eventually, without Palpatine's permission, travel to Tatooine to try and free his mother. But just like in Attack of the Clones, he would find his mother captured by Tuskens, and she would die in his arms. But this time, he had no Jedi code to cause him any conflict, no training telling him to show mercy and restraint. This time, it would not just be the Tuskens who suffered, it would be anyone who he could find any reason to blame. All the Lars family, Watto, Gardula the Hutt, and any of her entourage, and to be honest, anyone else who Anakin didn't like the look of at the time. Anakin, once his bloodlust was quelled, would leave Tatooine to return back to his master. Unfortunately, an angry Force user massacring people with a red blade is the sort of thing which draws attention, and it wouldn't take long for Dooku to hear of this mysterious dark side user and begin to suspect that his master was not being 100% honest with him. He would decide that if Palpatine was going behind his back and potentially even training another apprentice, then he should proceed to pursue his own political goals without Palpatine's knowledge. After all, we know Dooku did at least partially believe in the Separatist cause, and so if Palpatine was only using Dooku to pursue his plans, then Dooku could do the same. So Dooku would begin to feed the Jedi information anonymously. He would inform them of the clones on Kamino and of the Sith in the Senate in attempts to heighten political unrest and turmoil, whilst also trying to escalate the growing tension in order to try to start the inevitable war earlier and ultimately destabilize his master's plans. So how would the Jedi respond? Well, a Republic clone army would be investigated, much like it is in Attack of the Clones, and once its existence had been confirmed, it would only further the political unrest, as suddenly the Republic had a full-scale military after hundreds of years without one. But it would also provide some credibility to the claim of a Sith within the Senate. The Jedi wouldn't inform the wider Republic of this claim, believing the Sith to be a Jedi problem. By this time, Obi-Wan would be a very proficient knight who, although he wasn't quite a master, would still be regarded very highly by the Council and thus would often be involved in discussions. So once the claim of a Sith within the Senate reached the Jedi, Obi-Wan would be involved in these discussions. He would reveal to the Jedi what had occurred with Jar Jar and the blood test on Tatooine. He would say that he assumed Qui-Gon had included it in his report, but he clearly hadn't. Unfortunately, due to Jar Jar's prominent position in the Senate, the Jedi would be unable to investigate this potential lead without first involving the Republic officials. So after explaining the situation to a small council of Republic representatives, the Jedi would begin their investigation. It would, however, become apparent very quickly that Jar Jar was not a Sith. A blood test would confirm his extreme natural potential, but the Jedi would quickly establish that the Gungan had not been trained, and would swiftly end their investigation. This may have been an end to the Jedi's interest in Jar Jar, due to him being considered far too old to be trained, but Sidious, upon learning of the investigation, would become very intrigued by Jar Jar, being the chosen one. Whilst Anakin was certainly a decent apprentice, Palpatine, as we know, always likes to have contingency plans, and would figure that it would be irresponsible to pass up this opportunity at such raw power. So over time, Palpatine would try to get close to the Gungan, befriend him, whilst meanwhile training Anakin and Dooku and playing both sides of an extremely volatile political climate in a galaxy on the brink of war. Well, on the brink of war until Dooku would once again take matters into his own hands. He would simply deploy the droid forces to capture a reasonably unprotected, politically insignificant Republic planet, we'll say Utapau. This would, simply put, be considered an act of war by the Separatists, which was precisely Dooku's intention, and would spark the beginning of the Clone Wars. At this, Dooku would flee from Palpatine, intending to take full control of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, knowing that this act of rebellion against his master's plans would most likely kill him if he were to return to Sidious, that is. Palpatine would therefore have a decision to make. He could pursue Dooku to try to regain control of the Separatists so he could play both sides as he had initially planned, which would likely take quite a long time, which he wouldn't be able to spend manipulating Jar Jar, and could potentially ruin his chances altogether at seducing the Gungan. Or alternatively, he could allow Dooku to think that he'd escaped, at least for a while, relinquishing control of the Confederacy of Independent Systems in order to pursue Jar Jar, and then after he had successfully gained Jar Jar as his apprentice, he would get revenge on Dooku and continue from there. Whilst the latter was potentially more of a risk, it had greater potential if it paid off. Having already lost Dooku as an apprentice, and being entirely aware that Anakin was at least partially responsible for the current predicament, as well as not being overly gifted with the Force, Palpatine would decide that the reward was worth the risk. His plan would be to first gain Jar Jar as an apprentice, then dispose of Anakin, and then return to his political manipulations. So the war would, at least initially, happen as it appeared to the wider galaxy, both sides truly fighting for what they believed was right, rather than it all just being one large game of Dejarik, which Palpatine was playing against himself. On Coruscant, Palpatine would, over the first few standard months of the war, spend most of his time getting closer to Jar Jar, and after that time would successfully convince the Gungan to join him as an apprentice. Palpatine's motivation to train Jar Jar would only be increased by his lack of interest in Anakin as an apprentice. Sure, the boy had shown some potential, but he lacked a lot of patience, and rather than using his emotions to fuel him, he would often be completely controlled by them. The Sith should seek power through careful planning and manipulation. It was the only way they'd survived since Darth Bane, but Anakin had no interest in such things. Whilst Palpatine would figure that given Jar Jar's position position in the Senate, he must have at least some appreciation for political methods. So what to do with Anakin? At first, Palpatine would figure it was just best to kill the boy for convenience, but would then decide that since the Jedi were now at least aware of the Sith in the galaxy, it may be beneficial to allow Anakin to live, in hopes that when he inevitably drew attention to himself, he would divert the Jedi's attention from Palpatine, and Palpatine wouldn't have to worry about Anakin revealing Palpatine's identity if he removed his former apprentice's tongue. And if the boy found some other way of communicating, who were the Jedi more likely to believe, a mute Sith or the illustrious Chancellor Palpatine? And so when Palpatine was ready to break up with Anakin, he would take the boy to Tatooine and dump him there after, well, dealing his jaw and mouth an injury which would prevent him from speaking, and then return to begin properly training his new apprentice. After a slightly questionable start to his training, where his clumsiness would rather get in the way, Jar Jar would soon begin to truly embrace the dark side and grow in his power with the Force, drawing his anger and rage from the fact that everyone had always treated him as stupid and an outcast. Sure, he would still be clumsy and speak like, well, Jar Jar in public and to the Senate, but through Palpatine's mentorship and training, Jar Jar would become a ruthless and extremely powerful Sith. And that's where we'll leave it for today. The part 2 is coming really soon. It's already almost there, almost made. The final touches are just being added. Thanks for bearing with me over the last few months because I've had exams. It's taken a while to get this video out, and I thank you for all the support that you've given me. But I think that's about it. Remember to like the video, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. Thanks for watching. Bye.